So I would say absolute knowing, or the absolute idea, is a sign for a lot of people of Hegel's immodesty. The fact that he thinks, oh, I can arrive at absolute knowing, I can know all there is. But absolute knowing doesn't mean knowing all there is to know. It means knowing in a systematic way and following out each line of thought, or the fundamental line of thought, to its endpoint. And he thinks this is necessary for a couple reasons. First reason is that he thinks even if we think we're not knowing absolutely, we're always knowing absolutely, because our particular little piece of knowledge, or particular little truth that we find, it's always implicated in a larger system. And this is why he says knowledge, whatever vehicle for truth that we have, or for knowledge we have, has to be systematic, that there's no way to have a non-systematic form of knowledge, even if you think it's non-systematic. So even if you think, oh, I'm just knowing this little thing, really there are all these other relationships that are involved. So that's the number one reason why he insists on the absolute. But then he thinks, so then you could say to him, well, what's the difference between, if you're always thinking the absolute, why bother to make it explicit in the way that you do? What's gained by that? And I think he would say, what's gained by that is when you make the absolute explicit, and when you make it clear that we've taken our position all the way to the end point, and we've followed every path that we could possibly follow, and we've arrived at a complete system, then what becomes apparent is what he calls the necessity of contradiction. So there's a way in which absolute knowing is the understanding of the necessity of contradiction, or as he says at the end of Phenomenology of Spirit in the absolute knowing section, it's absolute knowledge is the knowledge of itself and the limit of itself, or its negative. So there's a way in which it's only when you know absolutely and you don't allow for any outside to thought that you really arrive at understanding the necessity of contradiction. So I think this is an interesting point at which he's critical of Kant. So Kant famously divides between things as they appear and things in themselves. So things that as they appear we can know, things in themselves we have no knowledge of. But Hegel's point is, how do you know what you don't have any knowledge of? And so his constant critique of Kant and of all modesty in thought or in philosophy and theory is, you think when you say, I can't know about that thing, you're already knowing about it. So if you think, oh, if you say rather, I don't know anything about the thing in itself, you've already said, I know that the thing in itself is something that I can't know, which is an act of knowledge. So in this way, I think an absolute knowing or absolute idea is Hegel's way of really making clear exactly that there is you can't have an outside to knowledge within knowledge. Like knowledge is just its whole. And that wholeness is expressed by the absolute, or the idea of totality. And so I think that there's a nice filmic example of this. So there's a film came out exactly contemporaneous with Matrix called The 13th Floor. Also a science fiction film. Also about this alternative reality where things appear a certain way. It's kind of ideological deception. And then there's the underlying social reality beneath. But what's interesting about 13th Floor, and so Matrix, the idea of Matrix is the desert of the real is what things really are. And that's, I think, a non-Hegelian, naive idea of what the real is, or what that the real is something beneath the fiction. And 13th Floor shows the way in which, no, the real is actually something we discover through the fiction. So one of the characters in 13th Floor, through creating a virtual world, discovers that if you go to the end of the world, or to put it in Hegel's terms, if you think absolutely, or he drives in his car, so he drives absolutely to the end of the world, then you discover contradiction, because what you discover is there's a point at which it's neither world nor not world. So there's a fascinating thing in the film where you see there's this green grid, and the all reality kind of slowly disappears into some amorphous blob. And that, I think, is this point at which that we see the truth of Kant's notion that we can't know whether there's a beginning of the world in space and time. We can see, no, this is what the beginning looks like. It's precisely this point of contradiction So I think that's a nice filmic example of what Hegel's getting at when he says absolute idea or absolute knowing and the necessity of it. So that's, I think for me, 13th floor, I think Matrix is pretty good, but I think 13th floor really seals it in a way that makes it a little bit more precise in the way that Matrix doesn't do. I think universality is one of those things that is radically misunderstood. So universality for Hegel, and I think for most thinkers, is not this imposition of some general rule on recalcitrant particulars that don't want to be subjected to it. Instead, Hegel thinks universality emerges out of the way in which particulars themselves need a reference to it. So it's not external to particular, it's actually this thing that emerges out of what the particular is not. The particular lacks something, the universal is what appears in that absence that the particular has. And so I think what's interesting is that Hegel believes we necessarily engage with the universal even when we're most trying to be particular. So his idea is that there's not really a way to avoid universality. Just like there's no way to avoid the absolute, there's no way to avoid universality. And I think he has this great section in Phenomenology of Spirit where he says, individuals pretend that their deeds and efforts are something for themselves alone. However, in doing something, and thus presenting themselves and showing themselves in the light of day, they immediately contradict by their deed their pretense of wanting to exclude the light of day itself and the universal. So that, I think, is a really nice way of understanding how the more you immerse yourself in your own private particularity, you're still doing it with this silent appeal to the universal. So I always think of the most private things imaginable, like masturbation or writing in a diary. Let's take writing in a diary because that seems nicer to talk about. So I write in a diary and I think I'm just writing to myself. There's no concern for the universal. It's my own particular thoughts. And yet Hegel's point is by even writing it in a diary, he doesn't talk about diaries, but his point would be, by even writing in a diary, I use the universal because language is universal, and I'm writing for, even though I may be writing for my future self, I'm really writing for some universal audience. So there's no way to do even the most private activity without having this inherent appeal to the universal. And so that's really what Hegel's getting at when he says there's a necessity of the universal. And he thinks in the end, the universal it is what uproots our particularity, but it uproots our particularity in order to make us singular. So I would say that Hegel defines singularity as how our particularity gets uprooted by the universal, and that produces what our singularity is. So our singularity is not what we first particularly are, because that's just an accident of birth. And it's not just the universal, it's the relationship between those, that uprooting that the universal does and makes, and the way it alienates us from our particular selves, and then the way in which that produces something that's utterly singular about us. So I think even though Hegel's is a philosophy of universality, it's universality in order to get to ultimately singularity. So it's not rather than a denial of singularity, it's actually the only way he thinks to affirm it. Well, I think for Hegel, the particular is actually the vehicle for oppression. It's not the universal that's the vehicle for oppression, it's the particular. And unfortunately, this is the best example of this happens in the 20th century after Hegel died. It's Nazi Germany. So Nazi Germany, the philosophy of the Nazis was, we're going to insist on our particularity against all attempts at universality. And what they hated in communists, Jews, etc., was precisely this, what they identified as the universality of Judaism, of communist, not the particularity of them. So that idea that if we insist on particularity, I think it goes down a very dangerous path, always. I think that's the necessary path that it goes down. And I think, it doesn't always end up in Nazism, of course, but I think that it nonetheless ends up in something that's similarly oppressive, because the particular always has a tendency to isolate itself. So at the very least, you're going to find yourself unable to find any way of challenging the capitalist structure that exists, because you're going to remain enmeshed in your particularity, and you're never going to think of a universal project to get us out of the capitalist situation, or to even better the capitalist situation. So I think there's a really nice joke about the problem with particularizing and the way in which the universal might contrast with that. So a gorilla walks into a bar, and he puts down $20 on the bar and says to the bartender, "I'd like a beer." And the bartender, realizing that it's a gorilla, thinks, "Hey, I can just give him back $1 change and he'll never know because it's a gorilla." And so he gives the gorilla the beer, and he gives him $1 change. And then he says, "Well, I'd like more customers like this." So he says to the gorilla, "Hey, how come there aren't other gorillas that come into my bar?" And the gorilla says, "Well, it might be because you charge $19 for a beer." So I love that joke, because the bartender treats the gorilla like a particular. He's like, this gorilla doesn't pay what everybody else does. And the gorilla says, "Well, why aren't you treating me like a universal subject?" And I think that's a nice example of the way. So the bartender, obviously he's not necessarily a Nazi, but he's behaving like the Nazi with the insistence on particularity and rejecting the universal altogether. So I think that's a nice example of the way in which the particular and ensconcing yourself or someone else in the particular can be very oppressive, or is just a mode of exploitation, as it is in the case of the bartender exploiting the gorilla. I would also say that the particular's very way of differentiating itself as a particular requires reference to the universal. So there's no way to say, "I'm just this particular, don't compare me to anything else," because the very way that you constitute yourself as this particular is in reference to other particulars, and also silently in reference to a universal. And so that's why Hegel says any kind of particularism ultimately ends up falling apart. It ends up being universalist even against its own will, and it ends up, and its attempt to avoid universality is the thing that causes the violence and the oppressive situation of the gorilla in the bartender treating the gorilla badly, or the Nazi treating the Jew worse than badly. In the philosophy of history, Hegel clearly says history comes to an end. But I want to introduce a couple of caveats. First of all, philosophy of history is not a book that Hegel wrote. It's a collection of lectures assembled after his death, and he first gave them in 1822, so long after he had developed all of his other ideas, even after he had written his last book. He gives his first lecture on philosophy of history. So it has a very secondary or even tertiary status within Hegel's own philosophical corpus. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, I think you cannot really understand philosophy of history unless you have first read the science of logic. And his students who were taking the class would have already had the logic, so they would have that as a background. So his idea in the philosophy of history is history ends when we recognize our freedom. Now, what does that mean? Recognizing our freedom, if you understand it through the science of logic, means understanding the necessity of some sort of ontological contradiction. That contradiction is necessary. Why does that mean we're free? Because it means any authority that tries to impose its will on us is divided just like we are, so that we can't rely on some image of a substantial authority, be it God, king, president, the people. There can't be any authority that we rely on. Instead, we're necessarily free. So that's Hegel's idea of what the end of history is. Once we come to the point where we recognize freedom is necessary because of the contradiction that we cannot escape. The contradiction, or to put it in his language, his other language, the subjectivity of all substance, the fact that there is no substance that's independent and undivided that can function as this thing to tell us what to do. We're on our own. So freedom for him means we're on our own. We have to decide for ourselves. And that's when we come to that recognition, Hegel thinks we're at the end of history. That doesn't mean, of course, that we no longer nothing happens. So his idea is just that once we discover that we're free, then we no longer have anything to discover in history, but what we have to do is figure out how to realize that freedom in the proper political system. And he did not at all want to dictate to people how freedom would actually manifest itself politically. So I think that's pretty interesting, that he didn't think that it was the job of philosophy to dictate the precise contours of a political system. But it was the job of philosophy to recognize we're at the end of history. We are necessarily free. So any political system that we develop has to have freedom as its basis. But freedom is not necessarily the liberal conception of freedom. In fact, Hegel's pretty clear that the liberal conception of freedom is not his conception of freedom. So it's one thing to say that we're free, it's another thing to figure out what that will mean politically, and that is a huge task. So even though it's at the end of history, that's still a task to be accomplished after the end of history.